The giant bride refused her ring until the tiny mountain man spoke her name. The wedding crowd gathered under the fading gold of sundown had been whispering for nearly an hour, their voices rippling across the open meadow like uneasy wind, and all those whispers stopped at the exact moment the giant bride, Mara Holt, 6'3", broad-shouldered, strong as a corral gate and twice as steady, slowly lowered the ring box the rancher had offered her, her massive hands trembling as she whispered a single word that carried farther than a shout. "No." The rancher, a tall, polished man with a new black coat and a crowd-pleasing grin, froze mid-smile, his hands suspended stupidly between them, as if disbelief alone might change her answer. But Mara didn't waver. She stepped back, boots sinking slightly into the dust, her eyes burning with a mixture of fear, shame, and something more private, something older than the rancher's promise of security and older than the town's expectation that she should be grateful a man had finally asked. A gasp rolled through the guests like thunder. Someone muttered, "She turned him down?" Another whispered, "A woman her size should take what she gets." And somewhere in the back a ranch hand snickered, the sound slicing across Mara's spine like a blade. The rancher's face reddened, pride cracking into something sharper. "Mara," he hissed, low enough for the crowd to pretend they couldn't hear. "You ain't in a position to be choosy. You think another man's gonna stand beside a woman built like—" Mara stepped back again before he could finish the sentence, her breath hitching, even though she'd rehearsed this moment all night. She wasn't refusing the ring out of cruelty. She wasn't refusing it out of pride. She was refusing it because the rancher didn't love her. He loved the idea of owning someone too ashamed to walk away. Her knees trembled under the weight of 100 watching eyes, but she stood firm. The rancher's jaw clenched. "You're making a fool of me," he growled, "in front of the town." Mara swallowed hard. "I won't marry a man who speaks to me like that." "Like what?" he snapped. "Truthfully." The crowd shifted, uncomfortable, unwilling to intervene but eager to watch. And just when the tension knotted so tight, Mara felt the ground tilt beneath her. A calm, steady voice drifted from the back, soft but carrying in a way no one expected. "That's not truth," the voice said. "That's cruelty." Heads turned. The crowd parted slightly as a tiny mountain man, half a foot shorter than every cowboy there, lean as a pine trunk, beard wild, shoulders wiry, boots patched 3 times over, stepped out from between the guests. Jonas Pike, known by some as the Tiny Trapper, by others as that little mountain ghost, but known by almost no one well enough to be remembered, except one person. Mara's breath caught, because she recognized him, and because he said her name before the rancher could spit another insult. "Mara Holt," Jonas breathed, the 3 syllables spoken with quiet reverence, as if her name was a place he'd been trying to reach for years. The rancher stiffened. "Who the hell are you?" Jonas didn't look at him. His eyes stayed on Mara, soft, sure, unwavering, like he saw her not as the giant the town mocked, but as a woman carved from stormlight and sorrow, standing taller than her fear. "I'm someone who knows she don't deserve to be spoken to like cattle," Jonas said. "Someone who knows she ain't meant for a man who needs power to feel tall." The rancher's face darkened. "You think she'll listen to you? A man half her size?" Jonas smiled, small, tired, certain. "She already did," he murmured. "Just now." Mara felt the world tilt again, but this time it didn't tilt toward humiliation. It tilted toward something she hadn't felt in years. Recognition. Because Jonas Pike, the tiny mountain man no one noticed, had spoken her name like it meant something. And the moment he did, the entire wedding ground shifted, every whisper fading, every judgment pausing, because the giant bride who refused her ring suddenly wasn't alone on that stage anymore. The man she'd once prayed to forget had just stepped out of the crowd, and she had no idea whether to run from him or collapse into the truth in his eyes. The meadow fell into a stunned silence as Jonas Pike, small, wiry, sun-browned from years alone in the high passes, took another slow step toward Mara, each footfall deliberate, steady, utterly unbothered by the rancher glaring down at him like a rattlesnake deciding where to bite. And though Jonas was nearly a full foot shorter than Mara, He carried himself with the quiet certainty of a man who had stared down blizzards and wolves and his own worst nights without breaking. Mara's breath hitched as he approached because memories she'd buried years ago came crashing back. Nights by a riverbank, laughter shared over snares, a tiny mountain man offering her a carved wooden charm shaped like a pine cone and whispering, "You got strength in you most folks can't carry." She had been 16 then, tall, awkward, already growing into her giant frame, terrified of being seen, and Jonas had been the only one who didn't flinch at her size, the only one who didn't treat her like a curiosity or a burden. She never forgot him. She just never expected to see him again, not here, not now. Not at the moment she most wanted to disappear. The rancher shoved forward, jaw locked, coat flaring behind him. "Back off, little man," he snapped. "This ain't your business." Jonas didn't blink. "I reckon it is," he said calmly. "When a woman's being pushed into something she don't want, it becomes everybody's business." A few women in the crowd exchanged glances, shame flickering briefly across their faces, but most of the onlookers stayed silent, unwilling to challenge the rancher, but unwilling to meet his eyes either. Mara's heart hammered painfully. Jonas was doing what no one else dared, standing between her and a man twice his size. "A mountain rat like you don't get to speak here," the rancher barked. "This is a wedding." Jonas tilted his head slightly. "Looks more like a hostage situation." A ripple of laughter, nervous, surprised, ran through the guests. The rancher's face purpled. "You think she'd choose you?" he snarled. "A man she could lift clean off the ground with one hand?" Jonas didn't flinch. He didn't look away. He just said, "Maybe size don't matter to her, maybe honesty does." Mara felt heat rise behind her eyes, not embarrassment, but something so tender it scared her. Jonas looked at her then, really looked like he was checking for wounds the rancher's words had carved over time. "Mara," he said, voice soft as river moss, "you ain't here 'cause you wanted this. You're here 'cause he cornered you with it." The rancher whipped around. "Cornered? I offered her a home." Jonas raised an eyebrow. "Did you ever ask her what she wanted instead?" The rancher sputtered. The crowd stared, and for the first time since stepping onto the stage, Mara felt space open around her, space to breathe, space to exist, space to remember who she was before shame started shaping her choices. Jonas kept his eyes on her. "If you don't want that ring," he said gently, "you don't got to justify it. Not to him, not to them, not to anybody." Mara's throat tightened painfully, her voice barely a whisper. "But the town," Jonas shook his head. "Let 'em talk, let 'em guess, let 'em be wrong. You're the only one who's got to live inside your skin." Someone in the back muttered, "She's too big to be this delicate," but Jonas snapped his gaze toward them, and the look he gave shut every whisper down. "She ain't delicate," Jonas said firmly. "She's strong, strong enough to walk away from a man who don't deserve her." The rancher lunged, grabbing Mara's wrist as though claiming possession. "You think you can refuse me and humiliate me like this?" Mara's breath hitched, fear flaring, until Jonas was suddenly between them, moving so fast the rancher blinked in shock as the tiny trapper shoved his hand off her with a force that didn't match his size. "Touch her again," Jonas said quietly, "and you'll see just how dangerous small can be." The rancher stepped back, stunned. The crowd held its breath. Mara looked at Jonas, not at his height, not at his patched boots, not at the roughness of his hands, but at the fire in his eyes, the kind of fire she'd never seen in the ranchers, the kind of fire she'd always wanted someone to have for her. "Jonas," she whispered. He swallowed, his voice barely steady. "I spoke your name today 'cause you deserve to hear it said with respect." Her chest ached. Why come now? His gaze softened, his jaw working as though wrestling the truth. "'Cause the first time I knew I loved you," he said quietly, "you walked away before I got the courage to say it." Mara's breath broke. The rancher stiffened. The crowd leaned in, and the tiny mountain man, standing barely to her shoulder, spoke the truth she'd needed her entire life, at the exact moment she needed it most. The meadow felt too small for the weight of what Jonas had just said, the golden dusk collapsing around Mara like a warm but trembling curtain as the crowd leaned forward, breath held, waiting to see what the giant bride would do now that the tiny mountain man had spoken truth straight into the heart she'd spent years trying to armor. Mara's chest rose in a shuddering breath, but before she could answer Jonas, the rancher stormed between them, his boots stomping dust into the air, his pride blistered raw in front of all the neighbors he'd expected to impress. "This is ridiculous," he spat, pointing at Jonas as if the smaller man were an insect he could crush with a thumb. "You're going to throw away a stable future for, what, a runt with a beard?" Jonas didn't react, but the crowd did. Women whispering, men shifting uncomfortably. The cruelty of the words hitting harder now that someone had finally spoken against the rancher's smug arrogance. Mara swallowed, her voice caught under years of shame she'd never had the strength to name aloud, and Jonas sensed it, taking half a step closer to her without touching her, creating a space where she didn't have to stand alone. "Why refuse?" the rancher demanded, louder now, as if volume could force obedience. "Why embarrass me in front of half the valley? Why make a fool out of me?" Mara felt the words like blows. She had heard versions of them all her life. "Why are you built like that? Why can't you be softer? Why can't you be smaller? Why can't you be grateful?" And now, with the rancher's anger sharpening into accusation, she felt them rising again, crawling into her throat until Jonas's voice cut through the noise like a blade. "She don't owe you an answer," Jonas said. The rancher laughed, ugly and bitter. "She owes me everything. I offered her a marriage. I offered her a family name. I offered her—" "A cage," Mara whispered, the soft words hitting the dirt like a dropped stone. The rancher blinked, taken aback. "What did you say?" Mara breathed once, slow, steady, her voice trembling but growing stronger. "You offered me a cage, not a home." Gasps fluttered around the meadow. The rancher sputtered, but Mara kept speaking, her voice cracking only once. "When you asked me to marry you, you didn't even look at my face," she said. "Your eyes were on my hands, my shoulders. You talked about how I'd be useful, how I'd pull my weight, how I'd make a good worker more than a good wife." She inhaled sharply. "You never asked me what I wanted." The rancher stepped closer, voice low with anger. "I asked what mattered: stability, order, a woman built to endure." Mara flinched, just a small tremor, but Jonas saw it, and that was enough. Jonas stepped between them again, not aggressively, just firmly, placing his smaller frame like a barricade carved from stubborn mountain granite. "You don't talk to her like that," Jonas said. The rancher scoffed. "Or what, you'll fight me?" Jonas didn't raise his voice. "If I gotta." The rancher barked a humorless laugh. "I'd snap you like a twig." Jonas's jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. "Maybe," he said quietly, "but you'd have to earn it." A ripple of shock fluttered through the crowd. Some of the men exchanged glances, respect glinting where mockery once lived. The rancher's confidence faltered. "Why's this even happening?" he demanded, spinning toward Mara. "Tell them why you really refused me. Tell them the truth." Mara's heart hammered. Jonas looked at her not with pressure, not with expectation, but with a softness that steadied her spine. "Tell him," Jonas encouraged gently, "if you want." Mara closed her eyes for one breath, then opened them with a clarity she hadn't felt in years. "The truth," she said, voice steady now, "is that I spent most of my life believing no man would ever want me." Jonas's breath caught. The crowd sobered. "I believed my size made me less," Mara continued, her voice trembling. "Unwanted. Too much. Too big for affection, too big for softness, too big for someone to say my name gently." She swallowed, and tears gathered despite her stubborn will. "And then she nodded toward Jonas, "once told me I wasn't too much for the right heart." Jonas blinked hard, his jaw clenching as emotion stabbed through him. The rancher scoffed. "That was years ago, a childish crush." But Mara shook her head. "No, it was the first time I felt seen." Jonas stepped toward her slowly. "I meant every word," Mara exhaled shakily. "I refused the ring," she said, her gaze settling on the rancher, "because you didn't choose me. You chose usefulness." She turned her head toward Jonas. "And he chose my name." Jonas swallowed, voice barely steady. "I never stopped knowing it." For the first time in her adult life, Mara didn't shrink. She rose. Taller than her shame, taller than the rancher's anger, taller than the meadow full of watching eyes, and the tiny mountain man standing beside her looked like the only one who had ever matched her in courage, no matter the difference in height. A hush fell across the meadow as the weight of Mara's words settled into the dirt like deep roots, anchoring the moment so firmly that even the wind seemed to pause. But the rancher, unable to bear the shift of attention, the tilt of power, the way the crowd's sympathy began sliding toward the giant bride and the tiny stranger, stepped forward again, his voice trembling with rage and humiliation. "What's this nonsense?" he snapped, pointing at Jonas with a shaking finger. "You knew her years ago? You think anybody here believes that? A big woman like her running around with a stump like you?" Jonas's jaw tightened, but he didn't look away from Mara, didn't give the rancher the satisfaction of acknowledging him. Instead, he said softly, "Tell him what really happened that summer, Mara." Her pulse hammered against her ribs. She wasn't sure she could, but Jonas's voice, quiet, steady, patient, reached into a memory she'd long tried to bury. She drew a shaky breath. "When I was 16, she began, her voice soft but carrying. "I left home for 3 days. Nobody knew why. Nobody asked when I came back." The rancher scoffed loudly. "Probably ran off to get attention." Mara ignored him. "I ran because I thought I was too big," she said. "Too strange, too much for anyone to ever love." Jonas's eyes softened like dawn breaking over stone. "You weren't too much," he murmured. Mara's throat tightened. "I ended up lost in the foothills after a storm," she said. "Cold, soaked, terrified. I could barely keep standing." A murmur moved through the crowd, some embarrassed they'd never known, others ashamed they'd never wondered. "And then," Mara continued, "a tiny mountain man found me." Jonas finally looked at the rancher, his expression unreadable. "That'd be me." The rancher's lips curled. "You expect us to believe you saved her? You can't even reach her shoulder." Jonas shrugged once. Storm didn't care about size, neither did she. Mara felt heat bloom in her cheeks. "He built a shelter from branches and canvas," she said. "He gave me all his blankets. He stayed awake all night in the rain, feeding the fire to keep me warm." Jonas looked down. "Didn't feel brave then," he admitted. "Just didn't want a girl dying alone on a mountain." "And," Mara continued, her voice trembling, "when I cried in the middle of the night and said nobody would ever want someone like me, he didn't laugh. He didn't argue. He just said—" Her voice broke. Jonas whispered the memory aloud, finishing for her, "You ain't too much for the right person." The meadow inhaled sharply. Something inside Mara cracked open. Something old, something wounded, something she thought she'd buried under chores and shame and expectations. She blinked, eyes stinging. "And when morning came," she said, "I left before he woke up because I was afraid that if he saw me clearly, he'd change his mind. I never even thanked him." Jonas swallowed, his voice barely audible. "I looked for you for 2 days. Mara's breath hitched. The rancher could feel the crowd turning, so he lunged back into the moment with venom. "Enough of this fairy tale garbage," he barked. "She refused me because she's foolish, because she thinks she deserves better than a ranch, a stable life, a man who'd provide—" Jonas cut in, still calm. "She refused you because she'd rather stand alone than be belittled for the rest of her days." The rancher rounded on him. "Shut your mouth." Jonas didn't move. "No, you shut yours." Gasps, a few impressed whistles. The rancher went red. "You think you know her? You knew her for one night years ago." Jonas shook his head slowly. "I knew who she was the moment she cried into her knees, thinking she weren't worth loving. And I know who she is now." He turned toward her, voice soft. "You're the same woman, just taller, just braver." Mara's chest heaved, her breath breaking under a mixture of shame and something dangerously close to hope. Jonas continued, his voice steady but cracked at the edges. "I remembered your name every day after that night. That's why I spoke it." The rancher scoffed. "And what? You expect her to fall into your arms 'cause you saved her once?" Jonas shrugged lightly. "Nah, I expect her to choose for herself." Mara's breath froze. Jonas took one more step closer, not touching her, not assuming anything, just closing the distance that memory had opened. "Mara Holt," he said gently, "I didn't come here to win you. I came because you deserved someone to stand between you and a man who don't respect you." The rancher growled, "I'll kill you for this." Jonas gave him a tired smile. "Get in line," the crowd erupted. Mara felt something inside her shift profoundly, like a door had suddenly opened in her ribs. For the first time in her life, she wasn't too big, too much, too inconvenient. She was someone worth defending, someone worth remembering. Someone whose name was spoken gently by a man she'd once believed too small for her future, and now realized was the only one tall enough to reach her heart. The rancher's face twisted as the truth between Mara and Jonas settled over the meadow like dusk sliding into night, his pride buckling under the weight of a story he couldn't control, and he lurched forward with the unsteady fury of a man who realized he was no longer the center of the crowd's approval. But before he could spew another insult, Mara lifted a hand, not toward him, but toward herself, palm trembling as if she were finally pulling open a door she'd kept barred for years. "There's something you all don't know," she said, her voice low, shaking, but carrying across the grass with a clarity that made even the restless horses near the fence still their hooves. Jonas turned toward her instantly, concern tightening his eyes, but he didn't speak. He stood ready, steady, a small mountain man waiting for the storm he knew she needed to walk through. Mara swallowed hard. "When I came back from the foothills that summer," she said, "I didn't just return with a story about getting lost. I returned with a fear so deep I couldn't speak it." She closed her eyes, breath quivering. "I wasn't afraid of the storm. I wasn't afraid of the dark. I was afraid of being seen." A ripple moved through the crowd. Surprise, discomfort, the kind that made people shift from foot to foot because they suddenly recognized a kind of pain they'd ignored for years. "I grew faster than the girls my age," Mara continued, "taller, broader, stronger. And the boys didn't know what to do with that, so they made me into a joke. A few women lowered their eyes. They remembered those jokes. Some had laughed. Some had stayed silent. Jonas's fists tightened at his sides. "They'd mimic the way I walked," Mara said softly. "Pretend I shook the ground. Call me a draft horse instead of a girl." Her voice cracked. "When I heard the rancher wanted to marry me, I didn't feel lucky. I felt chosen. And when you've been unwanted your whole life, being chosen feels like safety, even when it isn't." The rancher bristled. "You should be grateful." Jonas snapped his head toward him, fire sparking behind his calm expression. "Don't say that!" The rancher rolled his shoulders, irritated by the shift in the crowd's expressions. "What? It's the truth. I offered her a place, work, a future." "Not love," Mara whispered. "Not kindness, not respect." The rancher scoffed. "Respect is earned." Jonas took a step forward. "She's earned more respect than you'll ever command." The rancher swung toward him. "Keep talking, little man, and you'll be picking teeth out of the dirt." Jonas didn't flinch. "You'd have to catch me first." A few men laughed under their breath. The rancher's ears reddened. Mara pressed a hand to her chest, steadying herself. "I said no to your ring," she told the rancher, "not because I didn't want a future, but because I finally realized a future without gentleness is just another cage." She blinked slowly, fighting tears. "And I'm tired of cages." Jonas's face softened, some mix of pride, grief, and something deeper, something older, something that had clearly lived in him since the day he found her shivering in the storm. The rancher threw his arms wide. "So what?" he barked. "You think he's got gentleness? You think a man barely tall as her shoulder's going to give her the life she needs?" Jonas's voice came out calm, but edged with steel. "A man doesn't need to be tall to stand at her side. He just needs to stop trying to stand on her." The crowd gasped. A woman near the front clapped a hand to her mouth, stifling a laugh. The rancher sputtered. "This is absurd." Jonas tilted his head. "What's absurd is thinking strength comes from size." The rancher stepped forward again, jaw clenched, his chest puffing with the posture of a man who had never been challenged by someone smaller. "You think you know strength?" he snarled. "Try being responsible for a ranch, land, cattle, men." "Try being responsible for your own heart," Jonas said softly. The rancher froze as though struck. Jonas went on. "Land don't love you. Titles don't comfort anyone. And no woman ever felt safe with a man who must belittle her to feel tall." Mara breathed shakily, the words hitting something deep in her chest. Jonas finally turned to her, voice gentler than she'd ever heard from any man. "You refused the ring because you finally chose yourself," he said. "And that's the bravest thing I ever seen you do." Her breath caught, but before she could speak, The rancher shoved Jonas aside, hard, sending the tiny mountain man stumbling. "I ain't letting you ruin this wedding," he roared. "She is mine." "I am not," Mara said, voice ringing like a sudden crack of thunder. The rancher froze mid-step. Mara stepped forward, towering over him in a way she'd always tried to hide, but this time she didn't shrink or soften. She stood proud, massive, fierce, her shadow swallowing his. "I belong to no man who diminishes me," she said. Her voice trembled at the edges, but her stance did not. Not anymore. Jonas stepped up beside her, smaller by miles, but somehow the only man who looked equal to her in spirit. And as the rancher stared at the pair of them, one giant bride trembling with new courage, one tiny mountain man overflowing with quiet strength, something in the meadow shifted so profoundly that everyone felt it. The moment Mara Holt stopped being the girl the town mocked and became the woman who finally chose her worth. The rancher's eyes darted wildly between Mara's towering frame and Jonas's steady, unassuming posture, fury twisting through him like barbed wire, and before anyone could brace for it, he lunged, not toward Mara this time, but toward Jonas, fist cocked, trying to reclaim his dignity the only way a man built on pride knows how, through force. Jonas barely had a heartbeat to react, and the rancher's punch connected with his jaw so hard, the tiny mountain man staggered backward, boots scraping through the dirt, a gasp ripping through the watchers as Mara froze, breath seizing in her chest. Jonas's head snapped to the side, a thin line of blood forming at the corner of his mouth, but instead of falling, like everyone expected, like the rancher counted on, Jonas planted his feet again, shook out his hand once, and straightened with a grim, almost amused smirk, rubbing his jaw. "You hit like a bull," he muttered, "but you aim like a drunk one." The rancher blinked, thrown off by Jonas's refusal to crumble. "Why aren't you on the ground?" he snapped. Jonas shrugged lightly. "Been hit harder by mountain wind." A few people snorted. Someone whispered, "He took that." The rancher growled and lunged again, swinging a heavier blow, but Jonas ducked it, not with speed born of youth, but with the grounded instincts of a man who'd survived things the rancher had never even imagined. He twisted, using the rancher's momentum to send him stumbling forward into the fence with a loud crack. Gasps erupted. Jonas didn't boast, didn't flex, didn't taunt. He simply braced himself again, breathing steady, shoulders lifted in quiet readiness. "You want to fight?" Jonas said calmly. "Fine. But understand something, big man." He lifted his chin, eyes shining with that strange, magnetic courage that made him look 10 feet tall instead of barely reaching Mara's shoulder. "When you're small, you learn to be strong in ways size can't teach." The rancher charged again, furious, swinging wild blows meant to knock Jonas senseless. Jonas dodged the first, blocked the second, took the third on his forearm with a grunt, and then, in a single, fluid movement, he stepped into the rancher's space, grabbed the man's wrist, twisted, and forced him to his knees with nothing but leverage and grit, the rancher's howl ripping through the meadow as Jonas held him there, firm, unshaking, solid as a rooted pine, while the crowd stared in stunned amazement. Mara's hand flew to her mouth. She'd always known Jonas was strong in spirit. She had never realized he was strong in body, too. Jonas leaned down slightly, voice low enough for the rancher but loud enough for every onlooker. "You don't get to touch her again," he said. "Not with your hands, not with your words, not with your pride." The rancher struggled, panting, red-faced, humiliated in a way no one in town had ever seen. Jonas eased off, letting him scramble to his feet, not because the rancher deserved mercy, but because Jonas wasn't the kind of man who enjoyed breaking people. The rancher staggered, grabbing his shoulder, glaring daggers at Jonas. "You think you look like a hero?" he spat. Jonas wiped the blood from his lip with the back of his hand. "No," he said simply. "I ain't trying to look like anything." Then he turned to Mara, and everything inside her collapsed and rebuilt in a single heartbeat. Jonas's eyes, steady, warm, unwavering, found hers, and the crowd seemed to vanish, leaving only the two of them standing in a silence that felt sacred. "I don't know what kind of life you want," he said softly, "but I know you deserve one where no man ever makes you feel small." Mara's breath shuddered out of her, her massive frame trembling as she tried to hold everything in, fear, hope, hurt, yearning. Jonas continued, voice thick now. You ain't too big. You ain't too much. You ain't something to manage or use. His hand lifted hesitantly, as if approaching a skittish wild creature he didn't want to spook. You're just Mara, and that's enough. Something inside her, some old bruise, some long-buried ache, broke wide open. The rancher spat bitterly. This is pathetic. But his voice sounded small now, shriveled, irrelevant. Jonas didn't even look at him. You should go, Jonas murmured without turning, before you embarrass yourself more. The rancher stiffened, but the crowd's eyes, no longer on him, no longer impressed by him, no longer intimidated by him, made his shoulders sink. He backed away slowly, glaring at Mara as if she owed him something, but the shame in the air smothered him until he stormed off toward the saloon, muttering curses under his breath. As soon as he was gone, Jonas released a breath he'd been holding. He looked up at Mara again, small man, giant woman, and for the first time in her life, Mara didn't feel large in a way that made her shrink. She felt large in a way that made her seen. And the tiny mountain man in front of her, blood on his lip, courage in his posture, looked like the only man who'd ever stood tall enough to truly stand beside her. The rancher's footsteps hadn't even faded behind the saloon doors when the meadow shifted again. A soft rustling of skirts and boots as the townspeople looked from Jonas to Mara and back, trying to reconcile the story unfolding before them, a giant bride trembling with old wounds, and a tiny mountain man standing like a wall built from heart instead of height, and the uneasiness that had once been aimed at Mara now began to mirror itself onto the rancher's shadow, lingering like a stain on the ground he'd stomped across. For the first time since the proposal began, the town truly looked at Mara, really looked, and saw not a spectacle, not a joke, not a woman who should be grateful for any man's attention, but a human being who had carried more hurt in silence than most of them ever dared to face. A few women exchanged glances, regret flickering across their faces. Children stood wide-eyed. Older men rubbed the backs of their necks, avoiding her gaze because they suddenly recognized how many times they'd treated her like a creature built for labor instead of love. And Mara, still shaking, still towering, still bracing for shame, felt all those eyes but didn't shrink from them this time. Because Jonas was standing in front of her, small enough to fit in her shadow, yet somehow the only person in the meadow who made her feel safe enough to stand in the open. The minister cleared his throat as if trying to salvage the ceremony. Mara, he said hesitantly, you've made a very emotional choice. And perhaps, Jonas turned his head sharply, his tone calm but cutting. She didn't make an emotional choice. She made a right one. The minister blinked, startled. Jonas stepped forward, not aggressively, not arrogantly, but with the quiet authority of a man who had nothing to prove and everything to protect. You all want to know why she refused the ring? He said. Look at her. People did. Mara flushed but didn't look away. You see a big woman, Jonas continued, but you never saw the weight she's been carrying. Weight you all put on her. A few faces reddened. Jonas pressed on. You think it's easy being her size in a place where every man decides her worth by how small she can make herself? Where every woman whispers that she's too much or not enough? Where a rancher treats her like free labor and a trophy rolled into one? Murmurs spread, uneasy, uncomfortable. The truth stung deeper because it was theirs to hold. She said no, Jonas said, because some part of her finally remembered she don't belong to anybody. The blacksmith's wife wiped a tear from her cheek. The schoolteacher nodded slowly, guilt crossing her features. The rancher's cousin muttered, he never did talk to her kindly. The minister tried again. Well, even so, perhaps the mountain man here shouldn't involve. I'm involved, Jonas said, voice gentle but firm, because I'm the reason she thinks she's worth kindness at all. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Mara's breath caught. He turned toward her fully now, ignoring everyone else. When I found you by that river, Jonas said softly, you were shivering in the dark and saying things no girl should ever think about herself. I told you then you weren't too big for the world, just too big for the people who didn't know how to hold kindness. Mara swallowed hard. Her eyes shimmered. I didn't believe you, she whispered. I know. Jonas's jaw tightened. But I meant every word, and I ain't stopping now. A murmur spread through the crowd, something like admiration, something like shame, something like a beginning. The minister sputtered, "This is highly irregular." Jonas shot him a look that made even the Reverend step back in surprise. "Irregular's fine," Jonas said. "Cruel ain't." A ranch hand stepped forward, rubbing the back of his neck. "Truth is," he admitted, "we all figured Mara should just be glad someone asked her. Never thought about what she wanted." Another added quietly, "or deserved." Mara stiffened, because hearing it acknowledged, even if painful, felt like a splinter finally being pulled. Jonas nodded toward them. "Then start thinking now." A hush followed, heavy, necessary. Jonas turned back to Mara, his voice softening again. "You said you were afraid of being seen," he murmured. "But you've been seen wrong your whole life. That's the problem." Mara blinked, tears finally slipping free. "And you see me right?" Jonas's expression cracked into something raw, stripped of pride or hesitation. "I ain't never seen you wrong." The crowd fell silent, completely silent. Even the horses seemed to stop shifting. Mara's breath shook as she held his gaze, feeling something inside her ribcage, something she'd buried under years of mockery and caution, slowly uncurl. Then someone in the crowd whispered, in a tone that wasn't cruel this time but stunned, almost reverent, "He loves her." And the meadow shifted again, not with judgment, not with ugliness, but with the first fragile signs of truth settling into the soil. Truth Mara had run from, the rancher had fought against, and Jonas had carried alone for too many years. Thunder grumbled low in the distance as the crowd's murmur slowly faded into a tense, uncertain hush, the air thick with the smell of approaching rain and whatever fragile understanding had just begun settling between Mara and Jonas. Mara's heart hammered with a rhythm that felt half terror, half recognition, as though some part of her that had always been braced for mockery was finally daring to stand without armor, and Jonas, small, battered, lip split, but steady as the granite ridges he called home, watched her with a quiet intensity that made the space between them feel sharper, brighter, almost sacred. But just as the moment hovered, ready to become something new, the first lightning forked across the sky, white and jagged, and a sudden crack of thunder rippled through the meadow, sending the horses rearing and jolting the crowd into frantic motion. Skirts rustled, boots pounded, people scrambled toward wagons and porches as fat raindrops began to fall, heavy and fast, turning dust to mud in seconds. Mara stepped instinctively toward Jonas as the wind tore across the field, but Jonas lifted a hand, not to stop her, just to steady her, his voice low even as the storm churned above. "Storm's here," he murmured. "We got to get under cover." Mara nodded, but her body felt stiff, her mind spiraling back to that night years ago, the one she'd confessed but never fully explained. The storm back then had sounded just like this, violent, sudden, merciless. "I'm fine," she said, but her voice trembled in a way Jonas caught immediately. He stepped closer, rain plastering his hair to his forehead. "You ain't fine," he said softly. "You're remembering." Her throat tightened. "Jonas?" "Come with me," he said, touching her hand for the first time, the warmth of his fingers startling against her cold skin. "Please." She wanted to move. She wanted to follow him, but the memory hit, hard, sharp, merciless, her 16-year-old self stumbling through darkness, soaked, shaking, heart pounding with the terror of being too big for shelter and too alone for safety, hearing the storm scream around her while she hid under a half-collapsed ledge, praying for someone small enough to fit beside her. And then Jonas had appeared, tiny, shivering, stubborn, carrying a tarp he'd patched himself, looking at her like she wasn't too big to save. Mara's breath cracked. Jonas saw it, the way her shoulders curled inward, the way her breath shortened, the way past and present collided at the edge of panic. He didn't hesitate. He stepped in front of her, placing both hands gently on her forearms, grounding her with quiet, steady pressure. "Look at me," he said. She did. Lightning flashed behind him, turning his silhouette into a dark frame against the blinding sky. "You ain't alone this time," Jonas murmured. "I'm right here." Thunder shook the ground and Mara flinched, but Jonas squeezed her arms, anchoring her again. "Breathe with me," he whispered, "just like before." And somehow, impossibly, her lungs obeyed. Storm wind tore across the field, capsizing a row of chairs, knocking over the minister's lectern. sending the abandoned ring box tumbling like a small wooden ghost across the mud. People shouted and scattered, but Jonas and Mara stood still, two mismatched silhouettes in the center of chaos, one giant woman who'd spent her life shrinking and one tiny man who'd spent his life standing taller than anyone understood. "Jonas," she choked, voice cracking beneath the storm. I don't want to fall apart in front of all these people." He lifted her chin gently, rain dripping off his lashes. "You ain't falling apart," he said. "You're remembering what hurt you. That ain't weakness." A gust slammed into them, pushing Mara back a step, and Jonas moved instantly, placing himself in front of her like a shield, despite the absurd difference in their sizes. Mara blinked through the rain, stunned. "You're trying to block the wind?" "Yup," he said, bracing his whole body, every muscle tight. "I ain't tall, but I'm stubborn." A laugh, broken, surprised, escaped her, the first one she'd let loose in months. Jonas grinned even as rain stung his face. There she is. Lightning cracked again, and this time Mara didn't flinch, because Jonas was there, small but immovable, and something inside her rose higher than the storm. If he could stand in front of her like that, battered and drenched and absolutely refusing to move, then she could move too. She placed one massive hand on his shoulder, lightly, carefully, but with a certainty that steadied him this time. "Let's get to shelter," she said softly. Jonas nodded. They began to move, but as they crossed the meadow, the wind seized a large decorative archway, snapping its thin supports and sending it crashing toward Jonas's back. Mara reacted without thought, her giant frame surging forward, arms wrapping around Jonas, pulling him into her chest as she twisted, letting the heavy beam slam across her shoulders instead of his. The impact thudded through her bones, but she held steady. Jonas gasped into her shirt, voice shaking. "Mara, I've got you," she breathed, her voice trembling but fierce. "This time, I protect you." And as the storm roared around them, the town saw something it couldn't unsee. Not a giant bride too big for delicate things, not a tiny mountain man too small to matter, but two people who fit together like truth and mercy, each protecting the other in ways no one else ever had. Rain hammered the rooftops in thick, unrelenting sheets as Mara and Jonas stumbled beneath the eaves of the old wagon house, their breaths ragged, their clothes soaked, their bodies still trembling from the crash of the archway. Mara leaned back against the wall, her massive frame rising and falling in heavy shudders as adrenaline and memory tangled inside her, while Jonas, small, drenched, shivering, stayed pressed close to her side, not because she needed him there, but because he needed to confirm she was still standing, still breathing, still with him. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the mud-streaked smear across her shoulder from where the wooden beam had struck her, and Jonas's stomach tightened so fiercely it hurt. "You took that hit for me," he whispered, his voice barely a thread under the roar of the storm. Mara blinked water from her lashes, chest heaving. "You took hits for me first," she said softly. Jonas shook his head hard. "Not like that. You shielded me." Mara looked down at him, the tiny mountain man, brave and battered, who had stood in front of her without hesitation. And she felt something inside her shift, a pressure she'd been holding closed for years, creaking open like a long-sealed door. "Jonas," she murmured, reaching up to touch her shoulder. "I barely felt it." "That ain't the point," he snapped, surprising her with the fierceness in his voice. "You could have been hurt bad." She frowned. "You were in danger." Jonas swallowed hard, eyes shining with a raw emotion she wasn't prepared for. "Yeah," he said softly, "but you didn't hesitate. You moved like I mattered." Mara's breath caught. The storm raged outside, thunder rattling the beams overhead, but the space between them held a stillness deeper than the sky's fury. Jonas took a careful step closer, rainwater dripping from his beard. "All my life," he whispered, "people looked at me and saw small, weak, less. You're the only one who ever treated me like I was enough." Mara's throat tightened painfully. "Jonas, so why'd you run that morning?" he asked, voice trembling now. "Back then, after I kept the fire going, after I held the tarp over you all night so the rain wouldn't hit your face. Why'd you run before sunrise?" Mara's breath stalled. She pressed her back harder into the wall as the truth, sharp and old, scraped up her spine. "Because," she began slowly, I knew what it felt like to be seen wrong. Jonas's brow furrowed. You think I saw you wrong? She shook her head, rain droplets flying from her soaked braids. No, I was afraid you saw me right. Jonas stared, frozen, breathless. Right? You saw me, she said, her voice cracking. Not my height, not my size, not what everyone teased me about. You saw me as someone worth saving. Her voice dropped. I wasn't ready for that. I wasn't ready to be worth anything. Jonas took another step, close enough now that she could feel the heat of him despite the cold storm air. You were worth everything, he murmured. Mara's breath shuddered. I didn't know how to face that. So I ran. Jonas closed his eyes briefly, pain cutting through his expression like a knife. I spent 2 days looking, calling your name. I thought maybe the storm took you. Mara's voice wavered. It nearly did. Jonas's eyes snapped open, anguish etched in every line on his face. Mara. She reached out then, her massive hand trembling, and gently traced her thumb across the cut on his lip. Jonas sucked in a breath, shaking at the tenderness of her touch. I ran, she whispered, because I thought you'd wake up, look at me, and regret being kind. Jonas let out a fractured sound, not a sob, not a gasp, but something so broken she felt it in her bones. I never regretted a damn second, he whispered. Rain pattered against the overhang, thunder rolling far off now, the storm slowly breaking, but the storm between them had barely begun to soften. Jonas's voice thickened. I came today because I heard you were getting married. I thought, maybe if I stood at the back I could just see you again, just once, just to know you were alive and breathing. Mara blinked hard. Jonas, I didn't come to take you from him, he said. I didn't come to win you. I came because losing you once hurt more than any storm I ever walked through. Mara's chest tightened, tears mixing with rain on her cheeks. Jonas stepped fully in front of her, tiny compared to her towering frame. But for the first time, Mara saw that size had never defined either of them. But then he talked to you like you were furniture, Jonas continued, voice shaking with anger. And something in me cracked open, and I knew I couldn't let you stand there alone. Mara laid her palm gently on his cheek, her hand nearly covering half his face. Jonas leaned into it with an exhale that sounded like surrender. Jonas, she whispered, I refused the ring because I finally realized something. His breath hitched. What? Mara swallowed, heart pounding. I wasn't running from him. I was running from what I felt when you said my name. Jonas's eyes widened, every muscle in him went still. And what was that? Mara's lips trembled. Home, she breathed. Jonas made a soft, broken noise, something like a gasp, something like a prayer. And he pressed his forehead to her sternum, shaking with emotion, while Mara wrapped her arms around him in a way she'd never held anyone before. Gently, protectively, completely. Outside, the storm faded into distant thunder. Inside, another storm finally settled, and Mara Holt knew, without doubt, without fear, that the choice she'd made wasn't about refusing a ring. It was about finally choosing the man whose heart had spoken her name long before she believed anyone would. Morning broke with a pale gold hush over the town, the storm long gone, but its remnants glistening on rooftops and fence rails like tears left behind. And as the sun climbed slow over the horizon, the meadow where the ruined wedding had nearly trapped Mara Holt in a life built on fear began filling again, first with curious onlookers, then with neighbors ashamed of their silence, and finally with the minister himself, hat in both hands, standing near the collapsed archway Jonas and Mara had braved together. Mara stepped into the clearing with Jonas at her side, the ground still soft beneath their boots, her shoulders stiff but healing, her hair braided loosely now, storm-washed, her massive frame no longer shrinking, but carried with a calm, purposeful dignity that made the crowd fall quiet as she approached. Jonas walked close to her, not touching her, never assuming, but steady enough that she felt his presence like a small lighthouse in fog. And though he was tiny compared to her towering height, he held himself with the unflinching composure of a man who had discovered that courage wasn't about being large, just about being willing to stand when it mattered. The minister stepped forward awkwardly. Mara, he began, voice thin, there's a matter of the broken ceremony. Some folks wondered whether you wished to resume it, with or without the former groom. Murmurs, shuffling. A few people stiffened, unsure whether they were about to witness a confession or catastrophe. Mara lifted her head, the sunlight catching the edges of her jaw, her posture straight as old-growth timber. "There is no ceremony to resume," she said, her voice carrying with a strength that surprised even her. "There never was. A ceremony without choice isn't a wedding. It's a performance." A ripple of uneasy agreement spread through the crowd. The minister cleared his throat, trying again. Then, "May I ask what you intend? If you're ready to choose?" Mara inhaled slowly, realizing for the first time in her life that her voice mattered, not because the town gave it weight, but because Jonas had spoken her name like it deserved gentleness. "I am ready," she said. The crowd leaned in. Jonas stiffened slightly, not out of fear she'd choose someone else, but because the idea of being chosen at all was something he'd never let himself imagine. Mara reached into the pocket of her dress, pulling out the wooden pine cone charm Jonas had carved for her when she was 16. Weathered now, edges smoothed from years of being held in secret. She held it up to the morning light. Gasps fluttered across the meadow. Mara swallowed. "This," she said, "is the only thing a man ever gave me without expecting something in return." Jonas's breath stopped. "I kept it," Mara continued, "because it reminded me of a kindness I didn't believe I deserved." The minister hesitated. "And what does it mean now?" Mara looked down at Jonas, her eyes softening. "Now it means I know what I want." Jonas's pulse pounded so loudly he was sure the nearest spectators could hear it. Mara stepped closer, towering over him, shadow falling across him like a protective canopy, and for the first time in front of the entire town, she did not apologize for her size. She embraced it. She let it anchor her. Jonas looked up at her, rainstorm memories flickering behind his eyes. "Mara," he breathed. She reached out, cupping his jaw with one massive hand, thumb brushing the cut on his lip in the gentlest gesture the crowd had ever seen from her. "Jonas Pike," she said, voice trembling with emotion, "I choose you." A stunned silence swept the meadow, followed by a rising warmth that melted through the crowd like sunlight breaking ice. Jonas's body nearly folded with the force of relief and love surging through him, his hand reaching up to steady himself on her arm. "Are you sure?" he whispered hoarsely. Mara nodded, tears filling her lashes. "You're the only man who ever saw me without asking me to shrink." Jonas let out a breath that bordered on a sob. "And you're the only woman who ever let me stand tall." She smiled then, slow, tentative, blooming like dawn. And Jonas stepped into her arms, not caring that his head barely reached her chest, not caring that the whole town stared, because for the first time in their lives, neither of them felt too big or too small. They felt perfectly sized for each other. The minister swallowed, voice thick. "Well, I suppose that answers the question." A few people chuckled nervously, others wiped their eyes, and the blacksmith's wife whispered to her husband, "They fit better than any pair I've ever seen." Jonas pulled back slightly, looking up at Mara with a fierce, trembling devotion. "If you want me," he said softly, "I'm yours." Mara exhaled, every ounce of fear dissolving. "I want you." Jonas took her massive hand in both of his, lifting it to his lips. "Then let the whole town know," he murmured. "You ain't alone anymore." And as the meadow filled with the first real applause Mara had ever received, not for strength, not for size, but for standing up and choosing her own heart, Mara realized that being seen wasn't something to fear, not when the person seeing her was Jonas Pike. Now tell me, what do you think matters more in love, size, or soul? If this story touched you, like, share, and subscribe to Redemption West for more frontier mercy, courage, and love that stands taller than fear.